Chapter 21, Difficult Years. We read in the last chapter of the triumph of Wilberforce and his friends in their fight for the freedom of the slaves, and how the Emancipation Act became law in August 1833. It was natural that such a great change should cause many difficulties, and this was the reason why a period of apprenticeship was planned before full freedom came. The house slaves were to be quite free on August 1st, 1838. But the field hands were expected to remain at work for a further 2 years. Only their children under 6 years of age became free at once. The plan of apprenticeship caused much discontent, and finally it was decided to give all slaves, domestics and field hands alike, their full freedom on August 1st, 1838. Let us see what happened then. The first 5 years went well. In Antigua, where full freedom had been granted in 1834, the production of sugar increased and wages were raised from $6 to $9 per day. The value of imports went up because the laborers had more money to spend. St. Kitts also kept up its output of sugar and increased the value of imports. In Barbados, the laborers worked 9 hours a day for 5 days a week and received a wage of $10 a day, a free house, and also a plot of land which, if not more than a quarter of an acre, was free. But it was possible to get an extra quarter of an acre and pay rent for it out of wages. This extra land was usually planted with sugar canes, which were cut, carted, and crushed at the expense of the planter, and the planter paid the laborer some of the profits. In this way, a considerable sum of money was shared among the laborers. But we must remember that all the islands were not alike. In Barbados, St. Kitts, and most of the Leeward Islands, which had been settled in the 17th century, there was no untilled land, and therefore nothing to tempt the laborers to leave the plantations. In other islands such as Jamaica, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago, and many of the windwards, there were large tracts of unoccupied land. When the slaves became free, there were many who did not wish to continue working for their old masters. They moved to the unoccupied land, cleared the ground for small holdings, and built free villages. Others cleared plots of land and worked part of their time on the plantation and part on their own land. Many Negroes stayed on their old plantations where they had their cottages, provision grounds, and fruit gardens, but they often worked irregularly. When the planters threatened to turn irregular laborers out of their cottages, there was discontent. Where free villages were set up near towns, the smallholders could easily market their produce in the town. But when the villages were situated in the interior of an island with no good roads or safe bridges, marketing was difficult. Again, unless a village was under the guidance of a good leader, such as a missionary or a minister, there was no one to arrange for religious services, the education of the children, and the care of the sick and aged. And faced by many difficulties which they had never before had to deal with, the villagers often became discouraged, and the standard of living fell very low. While some of the ex-slaves set up free villages, others moved into the towns or sent their boys and girls to town to learn a trade instead of working on the land. Such towns became overcrowded and unhealthy, and many of the townsfolk became unemployed and lived in idleness and squalor. There was a great difference in the wages offered on various islands. Trinidad and British Guyana, for instance, offered much higher wages than Barbados, where the people numbered 800 to the square mile. As a result, many Negroes left Barbados for the high wages colonies. Some also left the Catholic islands of St. Lucia and Grenada for Trinidad, which was also a Catholic island. The planters did not like the paying of large sums in wages, and so they failed to attract large numbers of workers because of the smallness of their efforts. Moreover, as they had always depended upon cheap labor, the planters had not learned to reduce the cost of production and to increase the output of their farms by using fertilizer, plows, and up to date machinery. On the other hand, the ex slaves, disgusted with the old conditions, were naturally anxious to become their own masters by owning land away from the plantations. With the difficulty of obtaining labor and the higher cost of production, the British West Indian planters found it hard to compete with cheaply grown sugar from other islands, where there was still slave labor. Attempts to reduce wages caused discontent. Some planters became so discouraged that they left their estates after selling their machinery to Cuban planters. Other plantations passed into the hands of English merchants and ship owners, and the owners of some plantations were so heavily in debt they were little more than overseers for their creditors. Then came the final blow. Up to 1846, the British market had been kept secure for West Indian sugar by the heavy duties or taxes which sugar from elsewhere had to pay if imported into Britain. But many members of the British Parliament wanted free trade, so that goods from other lands could be imported free of duty. An act was passed which gradually removed the heavy duties on foreign sugar until in 1854, foreign sugar, sometimes slave grown, was admitted to Britain at the same rate as British sugar grown by free labor. In Britain, the price of sugar fell from 18 sterling to 10 sterling a lot, and the British consumer benefited at the expense of the West Indian planters. At the same time, beet sugar produced by help of government grants was beginning to rival cane sugar in the European markets. In England, as well as in the West Indies, there were at that time many difficulties in the business world. Many leading merchants in London and Liverpool became bankrupt. In the West Indies, the two important banks, the West Indian Bank in Barbados and the Planters Bank in Jamaica, failed. Besides these labor troubles, the British West Indies suffered between 1843 and 1853 a series of other disasters. Antigua, where full freedom had been given in 1834, began the new era with good prospects. But in 1843, the island was shaken by a very severe earthquake. 1/4 of the houses in St. John's, the capital, was wrecked. Sugar mills and boiling houses throughout the island were destroyed or badly damaged. Almost all the stone cottages of the laborers on the estates were destroyed. Owing to their heavy losses, the planters could not afford to rebuild the cottages. Many laborers preferred to take jobs as carpenters and masons, and these were in great demand to repair and rebuild the houses in the town. So the old settled life was largely broken up, and planters had to depend on traveling bands of laborers known as task gangs. In Jamaica, a series of droughts, in addition to the fall of prices, ruined the planters and reduced the smallholders to poverty. Estates once worth thousands of pounds were sold for a few hundred. Other estates were abandoned. Then in 1850, an epidemic of Asiatic cholera broke out. The disease was brought by a ship from South America, and between 40,000 to 50,000 people died. Epidemics also visited Barbados, St. Vincent, and Trinidad, and the mainland colony of British Guyana. All these troubles caused great hardships, and the output of the plantations decreased more and more. In the next chapter, we shall read how better times dawned after the difficult years of 1838 to 1852, and what means were taken to restore prosperity to the islands.